All right, here we are. Welcome back to Bookwave. Today we're looking at Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, Rules 5 and 6, starting with do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. I personally can't relate having no kids. How did you guys feel about this one, Pat and Will?
Same. I
I
don't have
mean,
kids.
okay, easy there, boys. I don't have children either, but I can certainly relate to the premise that, I was a child and I interacted with children and I understand the point that's being made. Like, this chapter is talking about suitability in social environments. And when you have children that don't do well in packs of their own, they tend to become isolated by their own devices, and isolation is analogous with punishment and breeds negative behaviors in these children that manifest as criminal things later in life. And so I got a lot out of it, and I didn't really even think about the fact that I don't have children.
And it also made me think about how, just by doing a careful analysis of children, what they are actually going through. Like, you can't just say that a crying child is sad or hurt. It's got to be something else than that. And the common emotion that Peterson brings up is anger. And anger is one of those common reasons for crying and being hurt. And anger and sadness and fear aren't the same thing. They have different patterns. Anger can lead to dominance, and he brings up examples of children that he has seen when he was raising his two kids. And he even brought up the example of Carl Panzram, which is in the next chapter, but it reminded me how Carl Panzram was treated unfairly and badly when he was around 4 or 5 years of age. Mm-hmm. And the most disturbing thing that I've discovered that Peterson brings up is if you do not let your kid socialize with other kids by the age of 4, they're going to have a difficult time making friends. And not just not having a difficult time with making friends, but also develop different personality traits like antisocial behavior, narcissism, and other types of bad behavior. And
if I could just jump in, I've got a really good quote here. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering.
I love you, Will.
That's a quote from Yoda.
There you go.
But yeah, Jordan Peterson's talking about dealing with these things head on and not succumbing to your children's tendencies. While the path of least resistance may be to accommodate them, in the long run, it's going to lead to more resistance and in a much different reality when they're out in the real world. And he talks about anger, you're right. And he also talks about dominance. And these children are testing the world they live in. And this is the most crucial time to teach human beings the quintessential lessons that they require to be successful, to be happy, to be healthy, potentially even wealthy in this world. And it's negligent to enforce bad behavior because you don't want to be stern and you want to be their friend. And that's the last thing they need. You're their parent. And for myself, as not a child and not someone with children, I look at like the ages of 0 to 7 quite often, because this is the impressionable age where you learn your strategies for dealing with negative emotions and positive emotions. But we talk less about that because positive emotions are generally pretty effective. But when you are, say, 2 and you're hungry, you need to get people's attention. And so you scream and you cry and you make noise. And then your parent assesses the situation, determines the need, and addresses it, hopefully. And if they don't, it builds up into this terrible gestalt that is used until you look internally at your own strategies of how you cope with things. And what I see a lot of the times in people my age are really poor strategies to cope with negative emotions, things that haven't been addressed and updated for the environment they're living in. You've got men acting like children because they never put the onus of responsibility on their own shoulders to say, I am feeling an emotion, but that doesn't give me permission to act in a mean, rude, or untowards fashion. There are alternatives to get what I require. And in fact, the positive way tends to yield much better results.
Yeah, absolutely. And he also talks about how none of us can avoid that socialization or brainwashing of society because we crave it and need it as children. And also the dangers of being friends with your child because your child is going to have lots of friends, and that's not what they need right now. They need someone to help them become integrated and socialized within their society. So they need a parent, not just another couple of friends in the household.
And the ridiculous juxtaposition is that we can go through high school pretending that we have the clinical understanding of people's issues and label our peers as someone with daddy issues or mommy issues, right? And we do that at such a young age. We can point out what the problem is in others. And then we enter into this new situation where potentially you have children and all of these problems that you had no issue pointing out the root of, you end up planting the same seeds for. And I think that's very bizarre how that can happen, that we can have this outward awareness, but not an internal awareness.
And he also brings up the fact that how to not shelter children completely from misadventure and failure, but to just maximize their learning experience so that the knowledge that they gain at a minimal cost is worthy. You can't just say to a child that you cannot do this because, ooh, it's scary and it's going to have a bad effect on you. But you can also just say to the child, okay, here's what's going to happen. And just calmly and politely show them just the minimum amount of exposure to something. And then over time, as they grow up, they can learn how to deal with this kind of big exposure, whatever that might be. And also, this is actually a good example of what's going on today with, a lot of millennials and Gen Z types who are not prepared to listen or expose themselves to different beliefs and values and principles and philosophies because they're told it's going to be bad for their mental health. But by sheltering them from these bad beliefs, philosophies, values, principles, whatever they might be, they do more harm than good.
It makes me think of that old phrase that we heard so many times growing up. You'll understand when you're older.
Oh, yeah.
That shirking of responsibility, the apathy that prevents people from being a good parent, that they don't want to answer every question, that they get worn down. And you can understand, and you can't blame them. I mean, historically, this is what happens. It's shouldn't be surprising if not every parent is perfect and ideal. I mean, the goal is obviously to get to that place, but I can only imagine how difficult it is, and you're going to have your off days. But as a whole, you want to be able to give your child and yourself the respect of teaching them these quintessential lessons. I'm using that word too much. It makes me think of a story that I heard, and I'm going to butcher it probably, and I don't even remember who it was about. For some reason, I want to say it was about Carl Sagan, but who it was about doesn't really matter. The concept is this. When this individual was a toddler, they attempted to remove milk from the fridge to pour themselves a glass of milk, and they dropped the jug on the kitchen floor, and the milk spilled everywhere. And they were just about to start crying when their mother said, "Oh, it looks like you've discovered a way for you with your tiny hands to not be able to carry this large jug of milk. Let's take the jug out to the back, fill it with water, and see if we can discover a way that allows you to carry it without spilling it." So instead of reprimanding the child for spilling the milk and wasting the milk, they looked at this toddler and said, oh, this is a learning experience, and there's no reason to shame this child and attack them with my anger and disappointment. I can just teach them how to do better. And if it was Carl Sagan, they turned into an incredible mind. And if it wasn't, my goodness, what a great model to have in your life.
I like that. Oh no, you messed up. Instead of that, just say, oh, good for you. You figured out the wrong way to do it. Now let's figure out the right way together.
Yeah, like, and that's just brings a tear to your eye.
Yeah. But that also is in contrast with not rewarding bad behavior. But that's not really an example of that, because obviously it was an accident that he spilt the milk. So that's a learning experience, but not to encourage bad behavior is something else to keep in mind too, because he brings up the example of kids in the grocery store not behaving very well and the parents not doing anything to rectify the situation.
Yeah, he brought up the first example of the couple with the child at the airport. Just the child just screaming at 30-second intervals, and they didn't know what to do.
And the other one that comes to mind is the mother with the son that was hitting the daughter. And instead of picking up the daughter and comforting the daughter, she went to the son, picked him up and said, oh, you can't do that, and comfortingly patted him on the head. And it's like, so you're saying he shouldn't do this, but you're rewarding his behavior with clearly physical reward actions, and you're raising a tyrant, and you're doing that because you're not aware of what you're doing, and you need to have that awareness. And it's a big ask, to have that understanding of what you're doing, but it's one that I think should be asked.
Yeah, and I think that's really the center of what he was going for in this chapter. Like, you're gonna do something to your kid, you might as well be aware of what it is and try to be the best kind of parent that you can be.
I will say this, his anecdotes about the babysitting experiences he had with the other parents in the community and the kids that wouldn't go to sleep, and the parents that said, oh, he won't eat. And it's like, well, no, he will. I'll win. I'm stronger. And then the parent picks up the child and it's like, oh, how'd you do that? And he's like, I just did it. I'm not going to tell you you're a wrong person. You're not ready to hear what I did, but the reality is there's a right way to do things and I'm capable of it, and I'm just going to smile and nod because that's all I can do. You can't tell a parent how to raise their child, not until they're ready to grow.
Yeah, and based on the interviews that Peterson has been in many times, you can tell he's very patient too. Not just articulate in his words, but also very patient. That's something that a parent should be able to harness when raising a child too. Whenever they're misbehaving or anything like that, just having a difficulty time adapting, being with the other kids, being in a timeout and just crying and bawling their eyes out, the parents can learn how to be patient with just developing the child, just watching them, see what happens, and just take note of what the child is doing.
Yeah, like this is a job, and it requires skills and it requires training, and to be able to be aware of the fact that you don't have the patience or the knowledge is not an excuse. It's a prerequisite to getting the skills and the characteristics and the knowledge that you require, and the investment in your child's development will hopefully pay out in the long run. Like in many cultures, it's the norm for the children to take care of their parents in their older years. Nowadays, at least in Canada, we have grandparents raising grandchildren because of what's happened in the past 40 years. And that's a shame, but you need to invest in your child's development. And in order to do that, you need to invest in your own development. You're not done learning just because you're able to vote or to have a passport and fly to a different country on your own. Just because you're tall enough to ride the roller coaster doesn't mean there's nothing else you need to know.
I think that's one thing that fits very well with what we talked about in the first rule. And I brought up the fact of how Peterson formats the book. It goes from the origins of, biology, and then it goes straight to the individual trying to make responsibility for his or herself, and now seeing what happens when they have a child, how they are going to adapt to this situation and what to do about it.
It is a really well-structured book. It isn't just 12 rules for part of life. It's 12 rules for life and all that it includes. And I think the way he's structured it is quite good. What's on your mind, Scott?
I was wondering what you guys had to say about his the last 5 notes that he put in this chapter. Don't multiply rules beyond necessity, and using minimal necessary force. Parents should come in pairs, understanding your own capacity to be harsh, vengeful, arrogant, resentful, angry, and deceitful. And the last being parents must be proxies of the real world.
Yeah, that makes me think of one of the things that you guys brought up earlier, the child in the grocery store that's not being reprimanded, but later being ignored when they're in a state of sweetness and goodness. And that vengeful nature that comes into play. Like, you can't be mad at a child when it's behaving and not deal with it when it's misbehaving. And I think his structure of rules kind of resonate on the same wavelength of Socrates and his absolutes. I think he approached a really good template there.
I really think the most important part is to understand your own capacity for evil, basically. That old line from Scholz-Nitzan comes back into it. Line between good and evil is between the heart of every human being.
Right.
And he also just like sprinkled in the concept of Unit 731. I don't know if you guys read.
What's that?
But he brought up when he was talking about people's capacity for evil, he just sprinkled in Unit 731. He just made a light reference to it and said, study up on that at your own risk. And I did. And it was atrocious. So Unit 731, just not that this is what the chapter's about, but tangentially, it was the site in Japan during the Second World War where all of their heinous acts of science and biomechanical warfare were orchestrated, and they had thousands of doctors and scientists taking people off the street, the sick, the poor, the old, the young, the homeless, the addicted, and experimenting on them in the same nature as the Nazi doctors were at the same time, taking limbs off one side of the body, putting them on the other, infecting them with diseases, and then operating on them while they were alive to see what was going on. And every single one of them got immunity from the United States in exchange for all of their field research. They created the plague-carrying fleas that they dumped in China, and they infected support rations with diseases and gave them to Chinese. And they did all these atrocious things, and they amassed a huge wealth of documentation that was handed over to the Allied forces, of which less than 5% were converted to microfilm and stored in the National Archives before being returned 10 years later. And the experiments went on well into the 50s and 60s, and there was no retribution for these people.
Wow.
So just another example of the atrocities that humankind is capable of performing. And I think that when people suppress, repress, ignore those dark sides of themselves, it's not good. It's not to say that you need to act on the darkness. It's that you need to be aware of the darkness. You can't have yin without yang. You can't have good without bad. And you need to be aware of everything that's going on to be able to act properly.
Especially when you, right before you decide to take care of someone else.
Absolutely. Like, you can't go into this half-cocked.
Let's
All right,
do
well,
a mid-roll break. And we're back, everybody. Now we're looking at Rule 6. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world.
This was a short chapter, but
Yeah, it was
also a
pretty short.
very dark one too. Almost like probably the darkest meditations I've read so far.
Yeah, and I really only have one set of notes for this, which just says, don't blame God or chance, just take responsibility. That's basically what it boils down to for me.
And he brings up various perpetrators throughout the world, just a bunch of terrible things, like the Columbine killers and Carl Panzram, and just what they have gone through. And the essential bit from all of that is things did not work out well for them. They were not a part of the group, so to speak. They were not part of the big trend. They were just a bunch of nobodies who ended up being treated horribly. And as they grew up, they wanted to harness that kind of abuse and spread it onto other people who didn't deserve it. And it's a dark account of how they behaved psychologically. They did not recognize what they were doing at the time. It was part of their own setting. Like, this is what they were going to be. And they decided to go forth and harness their power onto those who were innocent, were just living about their lives, taking care of themselves, doing everyday things, and then all of a sudden, they're gone. Everything's been taken away from them.
The excerpt from the Columbine shooters referencing the Nazi genocide and saying that they wanted to take it further and say that all of humanity is a virus on this planet and that it deserves to be eradicated is a very dark road. And it is disturbing to read, and it's not something to be shied away from. I think that people need to be aware of just how big that dragon can get, because it can happen to anyone. Just take a look at the Stanford Prison Project. And I don't know if either of you remember the anecdote about the woman who went to see the priest in this chapter, who had a miserable life and was hoping very much that all of the terrible things that happened to her were a result of her own actions and not because of how life is or how God has treated her, but that it was her actions or misactions that had caused all of this misery. And the priest says, well, why would you wish that? And she says, well, because that's the only thing I can control. If it's God's choosing, or if it's life's structure that has caused this misery in my life, there's nothing I can do about it. But if it's me that's the result of this misery, then I have a chance to change it. And I think that's something that people need to meditate on, that the common denominator in all problems is you. And it's an ugly sentiment, but after you swallow that pill, it's an empowering one as well. And you need to take full responsibility for the things that you're manifesting in your life. You are capable of controlling your reactions, and you are capable of controlling your emotions and your thoughts and your actions.
And that brings it around to the Nietzsche quote that he put in here. Distress, whether psychic, physical, or intellectual, need not at all produce nihilism. That is the radical rejection of value, meaning, and desirability. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations.
I really like that quote, and it kind of surprised me because I haven't read Beyond Good yet. I haven't studied any of the nihilistic school of thought, but it makes me look forward to reading it, because the assumption that I foolishly make when looking at these philosophies is that they're just ultimate and depressing. But that quote specifically made me realize, like, oh, right, yeah, intelligent minds are intelligent and they've thought these things out.
And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, how people decide what is positive, quote unquote positive, and what works for them. And it all kind of depends on what positive is, what it means to them. It could mean actual positive outcomes, that they will ultimately have a better life from misery and suffering. And then it's the opposite. The positive outcome can be negative. Which one is more meaningful? Which one works? And the answer can be, as far as I'm aware, is to pick out a value or a principle that you can test in real life, just practice it and just see what happens. Not go full on, test mode full on hardcore mode or anything like that, but just try it, like test it out in your backyard or in your room, so to speak, and just see what happens.
So in the training that I got a couple of years ago when I was getting the therapy certification, one of the things that came up was this notion that how you do anything is how you do everything. And I really like it. I subscribe to it. And it's interesting because when you look at it and you unpack it, you think, okay, but like anything is anything, everything. So how you make a sandwich is how you solve world hunger, right? So like the amount of care and awareness that you put into any and every action in your life is probably the same level of care, attention, and awareness you're going to put into any action. And so if you are like the activist in one of the videos on YouTube questioning Jordan Peterson, when she says, what advice do you have for millennials in resolving big world problems like climate change and poverty and the gender wage gap outside of making your bed? It's like, no, that's the advice. Put yourself and your house in perfect order before you attempt to criticize the world. Because if you want to go out and make this place a better earth and manifest heaven in this reality, how the hell are you going to do that if you can't even make your bed in the morning, if you can't even sweep on a regular basis, if you've got mold growing in your shower, if you don't know how to feed yourself or clean up after your cat, like,
or plant a tree?
Exactly. Like this is critical foundational advice. You need to put your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, because the world that you want to make a better place is only going to be so good as the world that you live in. And if you live in a pigsty, metaphorically or literally, then that's the result you're going to get.
Yeah, and tying in both of these chapters together, you gotta learn how to consistently take care of yourself before you can take care of other people in your life. That includes children or your wife or spouse, whatever.
And it's like, so we were talking before we started about a million things, but one of them was feng shui and brainwaves. And it's like, if you are living in a house that is in disarray, you're not going to be emotionally as efficient and happy and positive as someone who's living in a clean house that knows where things are, that isn't constantly losing their keys, that is not constantly having to go out and grab food at a fast food restaurant on their way to work because they don't have any bagels in the house and they can't get up early enough to make themselves a meal.
Right. It's all about building. It's essentially about building a plan, what you want to do, and having the ability to anticipate it when it's coming. And then you'll be wired to want to do that task. You want to be wired to get up at early in the morning, 4 a.m., 5 a.m., to do breathing exercises or take a cold shower and dress up or iron your shirts, clean the house. And then once it's all done, you feel a lot better.
And how much better are you going to perform every action if you have already started the day feeling empowered and you don't put the onus of positivity and feeling good on the actions of others, but actually being able to wake up and being satisfied with where you are gives you the energy to do with other things. If you have to deal with how stressed and angry you are first thing in the morning, well, you've already wasted mental capacity. And now your battery's a little depleted, and now you have a little bit less to give to the world.
Yeah, he really hits home at the notion that the easiest way to change the world is to just change yourself, make yourself better, because then you change the world by default because there's one less loser in it because of your actions.
Exactly.
Otherwise, the crowd will just pick you. They'll pick you up and infect you with their own groupthink and all that jazz. Is there anything else to mention? Is there something relatable to this chapter that you want to discuss?
I mean, yes and no. Like all of these rules are something that I've been struggling with manifesting in my own life. Like I think that's something that we often forget to mention is like, look, we know how hard it is. Anything worth doing is not going to be easy, and it's not to say that you need to look at your crappy life and say, oh, all of this needs to change by tomorrow morning. And I'm sure we've said it before, but look, it takes effort. But if you neglect to take stock of where you're at and make improvements and compare yourself to who you were yesterday and try to improve, you'll never improve. And you can't blow it off. You can't say, oh, I'll do that later, or, oh, I expected things to get better. You can't do that. That's a fallacy. There's no dreaming or wishing of living a better life. It starts today. It starts right now. Make the choice to do the thing. Just do the damn thing, and it will get better. It will get easier the higher you climb the mountain.
Beautiful. I think that's a good place to end.
I concur.
Yep.
All right. Well, until next time, may the force be with you.
Or
Clean up
equal to
your-
mass times acceleration.
Clean up your room, buckos.
Eat more lobster.